Okay, cool. Well, here we are. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone, depending on where you are. Um, Welcome to Urbit Developer Calls. I don't actually know what number this is. I've lost track, and we're going to stop talking about numbers of developer calls because we're just going to commit to doing these every 2 weeks, and it'll just be a regular thing. Today, we've got a pretty exciting one. At least I'm pretty excited about it. With Matilda, the interface team lead at Tlon, who has been sitting at the nexus of a pretty important shift for Urbit that has taken place over the last year or so in going from purely research and infrastructural development to product development on top of that infrastructure that has been built. And that has had some really profound impact on Urbit in the form of creating the community that we now have, the plethora of communities. And is a big part of the reason that we are all here and doing things like developer calls. And so, um, yeah, this talk is going to take a little bit of a step back from the details of the code and talk a little bit more about the history and the philosophy and the direction that we're going in and the effect that this work of building a product on Urbit has had on the ecosystem. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Matilda and enjoy.
Okay, thank you, Josh. Um, I'll cast my presentation here now and do my introduction alongside it. Uh, the bong noise is here. I have reasonable assurance that you can all see it. So I'm just going to go ahead and continue talking. Hi, I'm Matilde Park. I'm the landscape team lead and software engineer here at Tlon. Not quite the interface team lead, but you know, aspirations. I'm here to talk a bit about a landscape, more or less, the thing that we all use if you use the Tlon hosting product or run on your ship and like connect to a group or something. It's about its role, its history, and the process of releasing updates for it. And I'm also going to do a bit about the things that we're learning about the problems that we haven't solved yet, more or less. It's like we would usually encounter a problem in a process that would point out that we haven't solved a problem yet, and we have to go solve that problem. So it's really about that. I'll be doing so with a case study of the last release. That was kind of a fun little ride, the last bumpy ride, as they say. Let's get going. So this right here uh, is a diamond anvil cell. It has two diamonds that apply intense pressures to a specific object to mimic the conditions under the Earth. And the Urbit project, if you remember the Moron Labs post, which I kind of shoddily paraphrase in the description for this event, they seek to produce tiny diamond perfect code to create a small and easily learnable by one person 100-year computer, something that you could actually like boot up and like 100 years ahead, update to the present if you need to, or just like use it in the way it is. Um, and so with that in mind, I think Landscape's position in the bigger Urbit picture here is to apply pressure to the Protolith, the rock that isn't quite a diamond yet, to form the diamond, to create consequences and stakes on its way into our reality a little at a time. It's showing the little, okay, yeah. So let's start with ontology. That is to say, like, what is landscape? What's the boundaries of landscape? Well, at the bottom, we have these Gall agents and libraries. Gall is it's a vein in Arvo, the operating system in the virtual machine, and a vein is like a component of the operating system in the virtual machine that essentially handles agents, which are like almost like daemons, but not quite. They're long-running processes or microservices, as Josh would say, uh, that interact with other ships or other Urbit computers to essentially, compute or provide a specific application or service or product. So we have both the agents and the libraries. The agents themselves we'll talk about in the next slide. The libraries are more or less just standardized patterns. Like, for example, all of the things that we do in Landscape have the same networking logic for subscribing to other ships and permissioning their data in a group-based pattern. Uh, so I drew this the other night. Hopefully it's legible. Maybe it's not, but I'll be reading them to you as we go, so it's no matter. You can I'll draw a bit about this here so you can help separate this off. So at the very top, I would say this is like external, and then right beneath it you have the stores on your ship, and then beneath that we have the local specific things. So we have local, stores, and external. I don't know if that's really going to help you understand this, but essentially we'll start the middle here. So we have 4 different stores here that comprise the landscape stack. And don't worry if you see this and you think, oh man, I have to make all of these stores and hooks and libraries. Don't worry, you can do a monolithic application. These are just things that we had to do as we uncover the problems ahead of us. But yeah, so we break up the work like this. We have the basic data structure for landscape channels, the graph. We have the metadata store, which is the graphic group metadata for all the graphs in the group. We have the contacts store, which is the profiles for other ships, which gets federated over group hosts. And we have the group store, which is a list of peers with tags, admin, etc. And all channels require a group underneath. Okay, so these are the 4 things that you hold on your ship. We get them usually from the group host. So this group host will give us the group. Let's say everyone who's in the group and who gets treated as the list of people to permission these things out to. They federate contact updates. So if you change your contact to make a status, it will push that update to you. And if it's a newer update than you have, you'll apply it to your ship. And it gets all the metadata for all the graphs in the group so that if you need to, you can click on the graph in the list and subscribe to it from the ship that hosts it. So you have the host for the group, and you have each graph in the group has a specific host. So if you have a group where, there's like 25 channels and like anyone can make a channel, then that channel will be hosted on your computer, more or less. Not your like host computer, but like the Urbit computer. And we just federate out the people in the group, the things about them, and the channels that are available to join. And all of these channels use the same list of people to permission out who can say what or who can do what. Beneath that, at the very bottom, we have these utilities that are local specific. We have Hark, which is our notification store, more or less. Like it listens to the graph store and the group store, and if there's like a new graph activity that's relevant to us, like they say our name, or if there's a new member in a group, it will notify us if we've had that enabled. So it's specific to your ship. It's not like, it's not like saying Voldemort and everyone can detect where you are. It's like if you're subscribed to a graph, or if you're in a group and someone says you that your ship is aware of, you'll know. So this is a very natural and like localistic sort of thing. There's like a concept of earshot on your ship that's really intriguing. On the left hand side here, we have Sane and other utilities to administrate and debug your ship. You might use them if you're in trouble, and we'll walk you through it. And then we have our threads and our observe hook, which are just handlers for cross-door actions, the most obvious of which is if you leave a group, you want to leave all of the graphs in the group, or else you have some sort of mess where you won't be getting the updates, but you might try and resubscribe and they'll negative acknowledgement you, so you'll have to like leave the graph. I don't know. There's all these weird things that you need to essentially have a handler to listen in for downstream actions or side effects that we have to do. So we do that with threads, which do multi-step joins and leaves, and we do that with observe hook, which listens to different threads. And if something happens, we spawn another thread. Okay. So what else here? Yeah, let's move on. Above that layer, we have our JavaScript, TypeScript, single-page application, the thing that you use in your browser. You may notice that we don't mention any CLI component. I think it's an aspiration. Some terminal overhaul work that's being led by some members of infrastructure, and we'll have to grow that into a role on landscape eventually. We don't have a dedicated person building command line specific applications for these stores. I think that'd be really cool, and I think it's basically a mandate for conditions in which you're running a computer that can't, render complicated JS stuff. Now, this is what we focus on. Additionally, within the JavaScript/TypeScript single-page application, the Airlock Library, which is the library to create a connection to your ship or your Urbit computer, and to maintain a subscription such that if things change on the ship, we get an update to our application in the browser. There's like Airlock libraries in all different kinds of languages, not just JS or JavaScript. There's stuff in like Swift. There's stuff in Go. There's stuff in. Do we have a Haskell library? I think we do. But basically, if you're using Airlock and you're a developer, you're often like told to connect to a landscape-specific agent. They'll say connect to metadata store, connect to graph store. But you don't have to. You could create your own backend application that you subscribe to in the same way that you do for landscape, but you don't have to basically interact with landscape as your only method for configuring or modifying your ship or creating stuff to distribute. You could imagine like one day we'll have some sort of a base distribution of Arvo that doesn't have context store or metadata store or graph store. We have some sort of like there'll be some user space utilities like Dojo, for example. But more or less, it would just be the OS itself with it, like ready for the clients and the applications that you want to build without having to like bolt on landscape. But for right now, the base distribution is quite monolithic. Lastly here, I also mentioned that we have the Indigo component library. I think that's actually well worth mentioning. Our design team makes this component library of UI widgets written in JavaScript for our design language Indigo. And they do this so that when they make a mockup for us, we can directly implement it ourselves in a very easy manner. So if you were going to build your own application and you wanted it to look like landscape in some way, this component library, Indigo React, is available for you to use. And it's MIT licensed like anything else is. Okay. So yeah, basically, what does this mean between the difference between landscape and Urbit? Well, landscape is our attempt to prioritize a specific, really good experience that we think that Urbit is well suited for. And we also want to demonstrate what this computer can do. So what is that specific, really good experience? Well, it's communal computing. It's like a nice little buzzword for you. It's modular, extensible, interconnected, and above all, group-oriented. So you have, you know, stuff that you curate and stuff that you create in a way that is patterned among lists of other computers that just get it federated or syndicated to each other computer in a way that's permissioned and is interconnected because they all share a basic data structure that just differs in the interface. So the thing to note here is that landscape didn't start this way. It had an origin. Here at Tlon, there was a notion of interface driving infrastructure that wasn't always adhered to. I think as a company, we're always averse to being stuck with bad solutions. Obviously, because we got to this case here in the present where I recall this Crawford presentation where he talked about the history of JavaScript, saying that the difference between like Tim Berners-Lee's model and Mosaic is that Mosaic bolted on the image tag, and Berners-Lee hated that. He wanted it to be a pure document layer. But they really wanted images so that web pages would look like what they wanted, as opposed to just being web pages. So they kept it going, and it kept going from there. And then Netscape, on top of that, bolted on an application layer on top of all the document layer stuff. And Berners-Lee hated that even more. But people really wanted the web to be an application layer because it was just so hard to develop. And so we had this like big layer of just hacky solution after hacky solution that became the dominant. And I think at Tlon, we're always averse to being stuck that way, but it changed the way that we treated the interface projects we were doing. We began to be very careful about phrasing what the product was. I think that the last huge rewrite that changed the way that landscape worked was December 2019 when we released static Gall, which is a rewrite of how the user space vein worked to require everyone to rewrite the way that their user space code looked, like all of it. And of course, the surf stuff makes it difficult for a community of user space developers to root. If you have to rewrite your code all the time with little warning, oftentimes there wasn't any deliberation that we're going to even release static Gall until we had this Urbit dev push last year. And if you've ever tried to look at Urbit/examples, that repo, that code is always rapidly obsolescent. We were just shy of that maturity in which we could actually build a user space community. And I think that really started to turn around OS 1's release. but we'll get to that later. So I want to show you just the ways in which we phrase the product in the interface itself across the ages, but also like how we've got here and how it looks, and what that really signals about what we thought landscape was at the time. So this is a screenshot that I took when Modula came out. Modula is their code name for the initial landscape product that was released in June or July 2019. I can't remember which month it was. If you can't read that, I'll tell you. It says, "Welcome to the new landscape. We're excited you're here. Landscape is an experiment." Very important. It's supposed to be fun and above all, a good way to help focus our efforts on maturing the platform. Planned around where landscape is headed over the next few months. For the time being, experiment with creating your own chats and notebooks, reverse engineer a tile, and build your own. See what you can do. Enjoy. And for the latest, follow us or join us on Urbit Help with these with that nice little cute Arvo uh, universal resource indicator schema, Arvo : / call fast. But know here that it is an experiment. It's not our leading product. It's a thing we're trying out. And with that in mind, this was the home screen. I pilfered this from Ed on our design team's landscape then, landscape now presentation, which was just internal, I believe. But I think at some point in time we should really just show that. But the thing to note here is that it has an app-based launcher. It was still in debate internally about how extensible landscape would be. Who owned landscape? Tlon, the community? Like, is this like the way you build things for Urbit? Like we were sort of arguing about that at the time in June 2019. And there was an argument as to whether or not we should even provide tools. If you've seen some other presentations, there's some people videos on the Tlon YouTube channel. There's one that I did with Galen where we talk about my history of the company, but I was initially here as a prototype game developer for the Urbit platform. And at that time, Modula wasn't even released yet, but it was about to be released. So I saw the ways in which they had built applications for this thing, and I built create landscape app as a means by which I could rapidly prototype. And I still maintain it. It still works. It's increasingly hacky these days, but when I had built that product, there was some debate as to whether or not we wanted to really like say, hey, absolutely, extend this thing, put a million apps on your screen, you know. Whether or not this was like a coherent client or an app-based launcher. Anyhow, let's keep going. This is the OS1 home screen. It's where we were about a year ago, which is sort of crazy to think about. You can still find the OS1 launch video if you're curious on the, I think is it on the Urbit channel or the Tlon channel? I think it's on the Urbit channel. But we also kept the app-based launcher for OS1. But there was some signal for growth here because of one specific new application. Contacts. The story for contacts was more or less like you want to share these things across groups, but the whole notion of living in a group wasn't well defined. So you would go to a messaging application and you would see like all of your channels grouped by a group as a top level header, as well as the same thing in all these publishing notebooks and the links collections and whatnot. But it wasn't like a coherent place. We were still forced into this app-based model that was sort of incompatibility with the vision of what landscape was really becoming meant for, which is to say a specific group-based experience. And we kept making steps toward that. This is the way that chat looked. It was the new look that we pushed December 2019. And it was refined for April 2020 when we released OS1. But note that there is a specific signal of interconnectivity with these chat links. Essentially, you would click it, and it would auto join the chat for you. And we kept that for the latest release with groups, and we showcased the groups as these bubbles. But I recall I just bolted that in there. I was just like, I think we should do these things where it regexes out a regular expression, parses out a message to see if it's a chat, and it joins it for you if you click it. But yeah, I think that was a very a natural step forward to start thinking about these things as like a dense interconnected labyrinth. Though it really it wasn't quite well thought out at the time. It was something we just sort of bolted on. Anyhow, this is the way that landscape looked around last year in October. There was some things we changed about it, where we removed that sigil tile. We have your avatar on the top right, um, but more or less it looks like this still. There are some there's some tweaks. I wrote the leap feature on the top here. Whoop. I wrote that leap feature in August 2020, and it opened up another form of navigation that wasn't like specifically a tile-based launcher. It was a keyboard-based launcher to jump from channel to channel, which made it a bit of a hybrid approach. You can see here at the top we still have hybrid applications. We have these utility tiles, which are still like holdovers from the modular experience, and then we have these group-based tiles right underneath it. We have these single player and these multiplayer experiences that are trying to coexist, but we're still rethinking, like, what should this thing look like as we get further up from the app-based launcher prototype. Like, we've dictated that this experience is these group-based homes or these cities, as the initial document from Galen gave us all these years ago. Like, now that we have the suite in full as an app itself and not just an app-based launcher or a pseudo desktop environment for your applications, like, do we really need tiles is sort of the thing we're thinking about. And so these days, this is what my landscape looks like my specific landscape. It's just a blank screen. We have the option to lean more or less entirely on Leap. Of course, we also have notifications now too, but if you want to, you can remove your tiles. And we're still thinking about whether or not we want to like make that a basic function, but we would have to actually make Leap better for that to work, and we'd have to, of course, make it all customizable and extensible. But I think that we're rapidly leaning on this approach where you are just jumping from venue to venue, like you're walking into a pub. We have these like within earshot profiles, and if there's a thing that's like relevant to you, you might get a buzz on your PDA, so to speak, and be like, oh, someone needs me at that bar across the street, and I will go over there. That I think is really cool and very not well parsed in the old world or on ClearNet, because you can hear everything all the time, and so there's always the eye of Mordor on you, so to speak. Uh, what you really want is a human-based fog of war, or a localist approach where there is a distinction between here now, or like the things over there that I can't see or I can't know about. Anyhow, let's jump and take a step backward, and let's talk about Tlon, the company. Um, I was in an argument with Galen, our CEO, yesterday about this, but to me, so I will phrase that better. To me specifically, I think Tlon's been going through a process in which it started out as the research vehicle, where it was doing these interface and these infrastructure approaches to. Tlon is a product company with a specific offering, and the Urbit Foundation is the project steward. We're not quite there yet. Right now, it's still it's still sort of like half splitting out. And if you read my blog post Metaphase on urbit.org, I write a bit about this, where there's sort of a gradual splitting out of these duties that gives the website and the project, specific mandates. It's been gradually shifting because we started as an R&D company. We had all these spinning plates with all these huge ramifications going at the same time. We would often hire somebody to do this project that might actually change the way everything else worked, and there'd be like 5, 10 of those people. Um, Whereas now, around about April 2020, like when OS1 released, we ended up coalescing around a specific offering, this hosting product, landscape itself, and we're more or less in the position where Tlon is a product company with an extremely eccentric stack, and that stack is shifting to another entity with a mandate specifically to protect it. So Tlon itself is focusing on like, oh, we have this thing that we think is well suited on top of this very specific stack, and the stack itself has a protector, a core entity with its interests in mind, but a little at a time. So when I started the company, anyway, we had these greenfield infrastructure and these greenfield interface projects going at the same time. We were often rapidly starting one up, saying, oh, that didn't actually work, taking it apart, starting another thing up. And we had this gradual movement toward this emphasis on midterm scalability and optimization efforts. So whereas before we had potential, alternative candidates for like, can this replace Nock? Can we make Hoon look completely different? Whereas the priorities for infrastructure specifically, I think, became like, how do we scale up our network to support 10x or 100x people with what we have right now? Or like, how do we change what we have right now to be slightly better, as opposed to like a completely new approach that changes everyone else's code? Uh, but you might ask, like, oh, so we can't do greenfield projects anymore? Like, does this prohibit those efforts? Well, no. It creates consequences for those efforts. It applies pressure to those greenfield projects in such that like you have to take those steps very carefully, so that if you're going to actually change the way that everyone else is doing something, there's actually a consequence for doing so for complete re-architecture. So now I want to step forward into a case study on the things that we're solving in landscape right now, that we've been changing, and the things that have become relevant to us, like literally as we speak. Like I'm going to tell you, I'm going to tell you a problem that we're solving right now. So in January 2021, just about 2 months ago, we started staging our front end changes on a simultaneous bleeding edge stream, affectionately called the Big Yellow Button stream by some members of our team, but more or less it's just a developer stream. You can subscribe to it with an OTA command. Soon we'll be surfacing that in your settings menu so that you can opt in yourself. But in April, around 2 weeks from now, maybe 3 weeks, we'll be introducing more changes on distribution streams coexisting alongside the stable landscape suite on the live network. Why are we doing this? Well, there are additional issues resulting from not being robust to divergent code or data structures. We don't surface version negotiation or incompatibility to the user in user space. We do in Arvo and Veer as of December 2020 when Urbit 1.0, the binary, came out. Basically now, if Arvo's version and Veer's version don't play nice together or they don't work together, Veer will tell you, and you'll have to go download a new binary. But this non-robustness to divergent code or data structures makes it very difficult to handle cases where someone's landscape suite isn't up to date, front or back end, because people are using applications that consume landscape stores that aren't landscape itself. They might have slight differences in behavior. Both of those cases where things are up to date or people are using different applications, they just silently fail or they loop, because all ships right now, they just trust that everyone is in an eternal present. We don't have any notion of versions anywhere. Now, this made it difficult to do a normal release in 1.6. 1.6 was the release that we released February 6th. It was the second week of February. If you remember, that release had a new format for contacts in which you had a profile and you were sharing it with people, but it was also quite bumpy. So I'm going to tell you why it was a bit bumpy, and we'll step through the things that it taught us. So the OTA itself, the over-the-air update, had a new format for contacts, federated over hosts, that changed both the behavior of the application and the data structure for contacts. The first OTA that we deployed after testing it on our Ropsten, our Ethereum test node testnet for weeks on LiveNet code to see if it would migrate properly. The migration itself went great, because just to back up for a second, you have to migrate application-specific data structures to new data structures when you change the ways in which the application like trades data, more or less. It's like contacts had a new field, for example, so you would need to write a migration adapter to take the old data and do the appropriate changes to it to fit into the new application's expectations. Okay. So the migration itself went perfectly. The first OTA, which I'll call OTA 1, had a networking loop issue. Basically, people like Josh, who were very eager, they were editing their information twice before they got it back from their group hosts. And if they did that, they would hear it back and forth from the host to the ship itself, back and forth in a loop. So we had this I think it was fairly contained, but not sustainable condition in which if you edited your profile twice before you heard it back, it would loop back and forth. So you'd get the old data and the new data cycling on your ship. We wrote a fix in 10 minutes. It was very easy. We added a structure change to send a timestamp and only apply the update if they're newer. We'll call that OTA 2. So OTA 1, OTA 2 had a data structure mismatch, which wouldn't be an issue as long as everybody had the new data, but they didn't. Because OTA 1 changed to metadata hook, where it saved a bunted or a default value for agent Gall, the agent within Gall, which is an empty vase on save. An empty vase. I actually can't explain what an empty vase is very well, but we can get to it in the questions afterward. Basically, all you need to know is that an empty vase is not the data structure it wants. It wants a specific data structure with essentially, like, I think it's a whole bunch of cells of metadata information. But it would save this empty vase on save so that the on load the next time would fail. It would crash because the structure isn't what it wants. So only some ships saved the empty vase. Some ships didn't. So OTA 2, in which we fixed the data structure for the timestamps, succeeded sometimes. So some of the network had the timestamp fix, and some of the network did not. And so if you went to someone's profile, or if you're in a group and you asked for the contact information, and they gave you this big bunch of contact information that isn't what you expected, it would create a networking loop, which was burdened entirely on group hosts. So group hosts specifically had like extreme CPU pressures, and like their aims was spinning out of control, because our long-running subscription logic as it stands is, if we get a kick, resubscribe immediately, because we have permission to see it. But if we have data that we don't recognize how to parse, we will like crash on the packet, which will kick the subscription, which will resubscribe. This is extremely fragile. It applied far more network pressure than the initial issue even did. So because this OTA2 was prevented from processing due to a single unrelated issue in OTA1 that was only happening sometimes, it prevented the ships from even receiving OTA3 to fix that OTA1 issue, because they were backed up with networking loops so hard that they would need to sideload it themselves. Sideloading is when you download the OTA and just copy it into your ship manually. So in practice, the ways in which we had sort of punted the problem of versioning on subscriptions or on marks got us in a situation in which it made an otherwise perfect OTA. Like otherwise, like most of the things that happened to OTA went fine, except for this way that we handle versioning of subscriptions that made a fix not apply. It made us have to introduce subscription versioning. So subscription versioning is when you pause and resume subscriptions, facilitating two-way conversions if we have the adapters for it either way. Where basically we will subscribe to a specific subscription with a subscription version, and if the version is not compatible with our marks, then we will hold. We won't resubscribe. We'll subscribe to a versions wire. A wire is sort of like a path for I think, to subscribe on another ship. And if we get a number or a version number that we can actually process, then we will resume the subscription. But if we can't process it and it's a different version, we'll have an adapter. And adapters have a fairly linear complexity cost, whereas where if you have version 1 to version 2 adapters and version 2 to version 3 adapters on the publisher or the subscriber, and the other person is ahead or behind, those are effectively 1 to 3 adapters. They're linear. Liam on my team wrote this, and I think that he should really do a call sometime, because I thought this was kind of cool. He used Clay, our file system, to manage the cost of these conversions. And I know that Philip, an infrastructure who's been presenting quite frequently recently, wrote the initial spec, but I think that actually it fixes the issue in question that blew things up last time. But it also like opens the way forward for more divergent code or non-landscape code. So in general, this shows what landscape's role is. When I when I talk to people about the things that we're solving in landscape, they're kind of incredulous. Like, for example, like they're like, why can't I just store all these images on my ship? Why can't I just like shove everything in there? Well, it's kind of difficult to like host images in which you're pulling the binary data out of Clay and serving it to everybody across the network all the time. We don't know whether or not Ames can withstand that if everybody's doing it. We don't know like what the computational cost is of processing image files. Maybe that's been solved recently, but when we were doing that last year, that was the problem ahead of us in terms of why we didn't do image hosting. I usually say to them, in a way, it's a lot like developing in the 1980s, but it's reaching the present faster than you think. It's not actually like we're not stuck in the 80s. We're not 30 years behind. We're rapidly hitting the present. But the problems that we're solving kind of resemble those first principles problems that we're seeing uh, in user space and infrastructure. And I think that Tlon gets people who are willing to think about problems from first principles. We're like, we might think about how old world solved it, but we won't mindlessly apply those solutions if they don't make sense in this new paradigm. Landscape in this sort of in these conditions, it balances working around what we don't have yet and applying pressure on the parts that need the most work. If you think about the ways in which we rely on S3 hosting for large file storage, it it both like it works around a problem that we haven't solved yet, but it also like it makes our engineers and infrastructure want to make Clay more real in that case. Like it's like they show how good it feels to use these things, and they make it desirable to make these things happen in Urbit if we can. We uh, we lean on the present while we build the future, so to speak. Um, when I was talking to Lane about this concept, he called it like the ways in which they in Ethereum world they call it the flippening. Urbit operates on this notion of the host OS flippening. It focuses on the most interesting thing it has to offer first, the server, the P2P network. It relies on a host operating system to leverage what the present offers us already. People are always like, how is Urbit an operating system? How is Urbit your last computer? Like, this doesn't make any sense. This is an application in a VM that runs on my computer. Well, pulling out the host operating system comes last when it's trivial. We don't want to spend 20 years duplicating device drivers. We don't want to spend like the entire first half of our development cycle only targeting ThinkPads. We don't want to like make these costs so that we like punt the actual cool thing here. We want to use what the present offers us, and we want to go back when it's very easy and pull it out, so to speak. And we do that in user space, and we do that with Veer. We basically gradually work our way backward. Landscape signals the pangs while Urbit's reality seeps its way into the present. That is to say, we show the things that are really cool about what we have and the things that are really cool about what we could have at the same time by both working around what we don't have and applying pressure on the things that we should have. In a way, user space development and distribution is what you do with the new OS that makes you want to make it your only OS. And that's what Landscape's role fulfills as a flagship example. That's all. Thank you. Uh, that's my Pat P, my ship name, Head of Sigwin, but I'll be around for questions if you have them, and otherwise, thanks for listening. Okay. Josh?
And hello.
Hey.
That was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
For that. There was an
No problem.
absolute ton of information packed in there. I think that's going to have like fantastic rewatchability. I know
Thanks.
if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. There was one a while back about threads. It looks like Ted sort of jumped on that.
Oh, can Ted tell me what a vase is?
Ted, if you're listening, feel free to start the conversation about vases. I do have a couple questions in there that I'm hoping we can talk about a little bit, but we've talked. I've heard conversations for a while about landscape and how it's this application that is built on Urbit, but it isn't Urbit, yet it's packaged with Urbit right now.
Yeah.
And then there's talks about that changing at some point in the future, like landscape becoming just another application that you might install on your Urbit. What does the roadmap to that look like? And what
Yeah, sure. I can talk about that.
You see?
So right now, that's in the talk stage still. Essentially, I think it was around August last year when I first started to want to push that forward. this notion of like landscape should be downstream of Arvo itself. We want Tlon to essentially act like a third-party developer to the Urbit project, and we want the Urbit project to essentially have its own priorities that don't really um, necessarily have to think about user space because it's mature enough to make its decisions. So I think the dream future there is when we have a landscape pinned to an Arvo version in its own repository or its own project. And if you download a ship, much like part of the installation process is like a bunch of checkboxes to be like, I want to install landscape. I want to, I want to grab this and that, and make my own little basic distribution. Um, I talked about that with Phil. Phil thought that'd be a great idea to work our way toward, and I think that he was going to write like an RFC for that or a specification for that, and then he got tied up with the PKI stuff. So what's gonna happen is that either we're gonna have to wait for the PKI to come out, or I'm gonna have to write that spec myself and like lead that effort. But I would like that to happen like this year. I'm not sure when this year, but that's the best I got at the moment. Right now, it's quite tightly coupled in there, and I think that's rapidly becoming a little bit small. It's like living in your parents' house. It's like it's starting to feel a little bit cramped.
Yeah,
Um,
makes sense. I do know there is some work going on the notion of third-party software distribution. We have actually a
oh, that's yeah,
community.
that's in similar straits, I believe.
It's definitely related. We have to think about this bigger question of what an applicant like on there. But thank you. Another one, you and the interface team, but you being kind of at the nexus of them, probably have a pretty good handle on this. You've seen, you're probably more experienced than anybody with actually building applications or products on Urbit. So, what advice would you give to our viewers that may be thinking about doing the same or are doing the same?
Well, it depends on whether or not they're making something that's multiplayer or not, which is really the difficult problem. Because of the ways in which these applications work, they really are looking for either an application of the same type or some sort of thing that's compatible with it that it can take data and process it. So if you want to write a local specific thing, like imagine that I want to make a Gall agent on my ship that takes graph store nodes and like compiles them in like an RSS feeder list or something. Um, I wouldn't go about it just duplicating like hook store view in the same way that we do in user space. Like I think it's very useful and it creates a smaller code surface with a predictable pattern that reduces boilerplate and like makes it easy to manage a team of people and reduces the bus factor so that we don't need one person to like own something. But if you're one developer, you can do a single monolithic application that listens in on other applications and doesn't necessarily have to do the work of like mandating someone else have an agent first. Uh, yeah, I guess my advice here is start local. and work your way from like listening in on pre-existing applications before going in and building like your multi-ship so to speak. Like you could make a multi-user dungeon bot, so to speak, and build on the projects that are already there. We have chatbots that exist, so you could just like construct a multi-user dungeon bot handler in another language that just uses this bot library from there. You should start with the things that you know, work your way into the new world. Does that help?
Hmm. Yeah,
Um,
it's maybe.
and like start local without jumping all the way into the things that we're doing, because landscape is like an increasingly mature example of a thing on the platform, on the project. I don't know, on Urbit, but it's not necessarily the only pattern.
Yeah, this is a mistake that I was talking to you about recently that I made early on. You look at landscape and you go, "Oh, this is the architecture," and you think, "Okay, I should build my application in terms of this architecture because that's what an application is like." But that misses all of the process that went into arriving at that architecture. Phases of the cycle were probably very different.
Yeah,
Um, so what we have is what emerged as the course of the process. So
yeah. The
uh,
original the original thing for landscape was a whole bunch of bespoke applications. I think at first we were all using something called Hall, which was like a messaging protocol handler that Mark here wrote. He did the Duker presentation, and then we
Mhm.
moved to a store hook view model pattern that had uh, chat and I believe links were different applications that were both written in the store hook view model pattern thing, but chat used a host client pattern and links used a fully P2P subscribe and listen to each other pattern. And then we had publish that didn't actually use store hook view at all. We had this model where it was like everyone had one person that wrote the application, and so if something went wrong with it and they were doing something else, no one could fix it. And as a company making a product offering, it became untenable for maintenance and for essentially like fixing bugs. Yeah, maintenance, more or less. So we moved toward everyone using libraries and everyone using the same store hook view model pattern with GraphStore. Which, if you want to know more about GraphStore or about store hook and view model applications, I believe Logan's talk. Uh, is it called userspace architecture or just about GraphStore? It's on the Urbit channel here. It's a great watch. You should watch it. Um, yeah.
Awesome. Sorry, I'm just looking
I'm just
through.
I'm pulling out things from my head and like piecemeal here.
Yeah, we did have a question. There's a little bit of a thread going on about this as well, but about whether or not Urbit is going to try to solve package management or dependency management, software versioning. Um,
Oh, great question.
yeah,
A little bit about my pay grade though. It's like an infrastructure question.
yeah, it's a hard.
I think there's like there's a whole bunch of like arguments about whether or not that's what like desks are for. I believe I don't know. Like I guess it's like if you're going to rely upon like say you're relying upon GraphStore as a dependency and you're building an agent that consumes it in some way, you'd want to essentially listen into GraphStore on a specific mark version. In which case, I believe you would treat the other agent as a subscriber. In which case, you would convert down to it. So I think in that case, dependencies would be managed by version adapters and marks. I can't think of any other situation in which we have dependencies that are agents. Um,
Yeah, this idea of dependency management, it's not necessarily, at least from my take, being solved in a let's just solve package management all at once, but it's more like we've got lots of different boundaries between areas of the system that need to be versioned. And there was one update when we did the network breach back in early December that solved
yeah.
a big part of these problems, which was Arvo version negotiation. And so
Yeah.
now there's conversations about doing that same class of things for subscriptions, allowing subscription version negotiation, which came out of what you were talking about with, you know, the goofy problem I helped cause by doing
It was funny.
Europe.
I remember being in the bunker and be like, oh, I guess Josh is going to Bahia.
Yeah,
Because it kept
yeah,
saying it like over and over.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I was watching it just flicker back and forth, going, "Ooh, this seems bad." But yeah,
What was I saying? Shoot. Uh,
package management and dependency management, something in that space, or not. Maybe it's lost to
oh
time.
right, I was gonna talk about something completely unrelated to package management. That is to say that like you know these versions need to be surfaced everywhere, and they need to be like, I mean, most especially to the user or to the pilot. It should be like you should see like a blue bar at the top of your screen being like, hey, you need to update to get the latest subscriptions here. Because right now I think there's a whole class of bugs that come in on support at Tlon.io and on GitHub that are just like I'm out of date and I don't know. Um, Usually these things become loud enough pains that we have to go and fix them. But they're obvious things, you know.
Um, uh, Another question. So we have a growing number of contributors in the community that want to work on stuff.
Yep.
What, if you could just speak to them all on a live stream or something like that, what would what would you encourage them to work on right now?
Encourage them to work on right now.
Yeah.
Ooh, intriguing. Well, it depends on their level of experience. Like if you're like a starter developer, if you don't know anything about development, period, uh, normally if you don't know anything but development period, and you want to learn Hoon as your starter language, I would actually recommend you go and read the structure and interpretation of computer programs, because it taught me a lot about not just how Lisp works, but how about our computer works, because we use a lot of those exact same concepts. Not like, not everything, but there are a lot of parallels that make Hoon a lot easier to understand in terms of like, you know, cells or trees, I don't know, cons as they call them, uh, or even navigating trees. That's something that became a lot clearer after that book. If you know a language, or you want to learn like JavaScript or Python first, then I recommend that you do so. Work your way in with a library, and then just tackle a very small problem. That would be like a cool thing to have, Like say you want to message your Urbit from the command line, in a way that isn't like chat CLI or something, but like works in like a bash terminal, so that you can log on to your message of the day or something and just go, "Hey guys, I'm here." Like an auto prompt.
Hmm.
That's a very, very well constrained project
Hmm.
that is very easily solvable, because all you're doing is constructing an API action. And that itself will teach you a little bit about how things work, both in the libraries and in the stack underneath. If you know a bit more than that, like say like you write in Haskell or something, say you know other languages that uh, make Hoon a lot easier to grasp immediately, then you can start by building an agent that listens to a pre-existing agent. Um, and that seems to be quite tenable. I know that we have the WebRTC agent, which it seems to be written just like from scratch, the way that was actually like seemed quite legible. Um, and if you're like a Hoon guru at that point in time, well then like come talk to me or Josh, because we could use you. Uh, like I think you start working your way in. I think that the important thing to know about learning anything is that it's a matter of gaining familiarity. It's a lot like sitting in a bathtub and watching your skin prune. It's like, no, I mean, like, it's like the water seeps in, and then you have very watery skin. Like, you have to sit around Hoon long enough, and you'll get it. That's sort of how it was with me. Like, at first, it was like hitting my head. I was reading all of these articles, like Jared Tobin's Basic Hoonery or whatnot, and it just was not sticking. And then the first project I had at the company was the Dojo app, which was just a migration of code that Anton wrote 3 years ago. Anton is I don't know if he really has a Pappy on the network right now, but he was Pitype at one point in time. And that was just itself like teaching me how to take um, a library that was written back then and port it in a way that made sense with the things we had now, with a whole bunch of developer input and emails to figure out the things I didn't know. Um, what was I just saying? Oh, water, right? Okay, so nowadays, I don't even write Hoon applications anymore, but I find it very easy to read Hoon code. Just because I've been around it long enough, I know how these things work, and I know how they interact with other things, and I know that the reasons why things crash, and I was just here long enough, and I got it. It seems to be that way with everybody.
That's very
Um,
similar to pretty much any other language. Um,
yeah,
and that's
it's
always
like,
possible.
more things are about familiarity than you think.
Yeah, that's right.
It's never really about structuring your knowledge. It's just about willing to like sit around it in the right ways.
Yeah, and that's really what
Read 3 books, and you'll learn anything.
yeah, that's really what the root of the word easy is. It actually stems from things that are near at hand or things that are familiar. Easiness is
Yeah,
not actually an objective measure. It's a measure of
yeah.
just your familiarity with it. So naturally,
That
you're familiar with is hard.
that's sort of what I'm recommending with this like spectrum of pre-existing development knowledge. It's working from the intensely familiar and like gradually stepping into the unknown,
Yeah,
because you have to bear with us that this is unknown to everybody. Like, for a lot of people who think of themselves as technically inclined, they install Linux, and for any problem they have, they look up Stack Overflow and they find a solution immediately. They paste it in, it's done. It's abstracted, so to speak, from just referencing like an encyclopedia. But actually developing a model of mind about how a system works and stepping into it is still a fairly rare skill, and it's one that you should cultivate if you're going to work on this project. I think that even if you're working on like BSD right now, BSD is in a very similar place to Linux 20 years ago. In that if you have a problem, you can't find it anywhere. Like, you'll have to look up some mailing list post from like 20 years ago or 15 years ago to find one person who had a similar problem. So when it comes to Urbit, you'll have to step in as opposed to jumping all the way in and just referencing and like using it like an encyclopedia because there isn't one.
Yeah, a couple things on this thread I want to address. You talked about uh, structured interpretation of computer programs, which we often just call SICP.
Yeah.
Definitely recommend that book. It was really instrumental in my own learning years ago. But I should also say it's definitely not a requirement for
Oh no, of course not.
food. We have,
I'm just saying it's like it helped me.
yeah, it would definitely be helpful now for any programmer, really. Hoon definitely as well, due to the sort of Lisp inheritance that the language has. Um, I don't know if many people know this, but we have this community effort called Hooniversity, um, that basically was a couple of members of our community that put on a big program to teach Hoon. It's not well known that those two instructors, at least one of whom I know is in the audience right now, um, learned Hoon as their very first language.
Yeah.
No prior programming experience. And they learned Hoon and then went on to teach it to people, and it has been very, very successful. So um, there really is nothing intrinsically that hard about this.
I
It's just another language.
didn't mean to make it seem arcane. More or less
Yeah,
just that I think familiarity is the big thing. And for a lot of people who work at the company, that familiarity is gained by the communal environment that they're in.
yeah,
There's always a reference who can teach you a little bit about the model of how things work. And Hooniversity is doing so in like a kind of like a parallel or a shadow government, so to speak,
yeah.
of people who know Hoon. Um,
There's
but yeah,
another,
so yeah, if you're alone and you need to gather some mental models, that's what I would suggest.
yeah. There's another thing I want to address too. There's a little conversation about an elephant in the room,
What
um,
is it?
about a revolving door of new users, and that might have been true one like a while back. I think it isn't anymore, and at least it's not really for developers. We have tons of people that are working on their second and third grant over the course of the last year.
Yeah,
Um, I'm I don't really see that anymore. Not even with landscape. We've got tons of people that have been here
yeah.
for longer than OS
Yeah, I
one.
think I think churn has been a long-standing problem on the project just because it was both rapidly changing and iterating, and it was also sort of like actively hostile in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
When I joined the company years ago, they were like, "You need to learn who now." I was going through documentation. A lot of it was sort of out of date, or said the wrong things, or like didn't reflect code anymore. Um, when I tried to read example code in Urbit/examples, that also was obsolesced. If I went to ask somebody about how something worked, they were often wrong, or like they didn't know because they weren't the maintainer anymore. And if something was about to change, it was being held in like 2 or 3 different branches in different locations, and it was not signaled to anybody on any schedule that it would change. There wasn't any awareness that there were people outside the company working on the thing. And if you were actually interested in working on the thing, they were like, "Oh yeah, we'll hire you. Come join the inside the company." And that started to change when we were all remote, because then we had to actually like email each other when things were changing. Or notify each other. So we had common mailing lists, and then there was also a concerted effort to start to flag breaking changes. I know that we're not perfect about that, and it can be intensely frustrating. But I think that the problem of churn is starting to. It's not starting. It's already been lessening due to the fact that like things have a been changing less often, and b have been a lot more forward about when they're going to change, such that there is a reassurance and uh, an active benefit to doing so, to investing in the platform, because it actually has an intensely specific and cool culture, like of people who love seeing new things, and love seeing the low hanging fruit that you can solve. And there's so much low hanging fruit.
mhm,
Like there are so many easy problems to solve that just don't have the people right now,
yeah,
um, that do contribute to the project on a longer scale.
yeah. And if you're one of,
But I do think historically that's been very true.
yeah, yeah, that's right.
I don't think it's necessarily an elephant. It's something we have to solve. We haven't.
Mhm, yeah, that's exactly right. Um, we just as another reference to something mentioned in the in the chat here about the docs. We hear often Yeah, I'll answer this. The docs could be better, which is going to be an eternal truth. The docs can always be better, just like the code could always be better. It's just the nature of things that you work on over time. It can
Of
always be
course.
better, which is why you do it. If you've seen the Urbit docs in the past, but you haven't seen the Urbit docs in the last 2 days, you should be aware that they have changed really drastically as of 2 days ago. So our docs team uh, did a pretty comprehensive overhaul of the way that all of that content is organized. There's a bunch of new content in there, and we're making a pretty big effort to clean those up, bring them up to speed, make them more discoverable. I think it came out pretty nice. We'd of course love your feedback because it's a new change. Our getting started guide, or formerly known as the install and setup guide, has seen a bunch of big updates over the last month and a half or so as well. So we've heard about the docs. But we're taking that pretty seriously and doing a lot of work on them. So if you
Yeah.
want to help out with that, I can definitely put you to work and reward you in address space if you'd like to. And that goes for any of these low-hanging projects. This is my favorite thing to do, is jump on the phone with people and figure out how they can help wherever they are.
Yeah.
So please reach out.
It's important to note that until Josh was here, or until we had any condition of the Urbit Foundation, Urbit.org was doing two duties. It was advertising for the Tlon Corporation, which is selling you a story because it wants, people who are excited to use the project later, so it has higher numbers for people who might want to buy address space. But there's also the project itself, which itself has like things that work right now and things that don't, and they need work. And those things are trying to coexist together in a way that sort of smelled fishy to a lot of people. So you go to Urbit and you're like, how is this my last computer? Well, it's going to be your last computer. But like, how is it going to be now? Well, it just sort of seems like it's like we're over-promising and under-delivering. And I can understand that mindset. I think it came from the fact that the site and those two distinct entities didn't really have owners. The last big overhaul of Urbit.org, that was me. I wrote that thing, but I didn't own it because the moment after I did that, I was put to work on landscape, and so it was no longer my purview anymore, and it just sort of like stayed the way it was since then, from a completely different stage of the company. And I think that a lot of the changes here come from the fact that Urbit.org and the Urbit project, or Urbit Foundation more accurately, have someone who can be a custodian or a steward for its interests, as opposed to the interests of the Tlon Corporation. I think that's quite necessary these days.
Agree.
Perhaps too candid, but
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. Well, Urbit has never really lacked for people that are like insanely passionate about it. That's something you'll find here. There's a lot of vision to this project that goes
Yeah,
ends in years, not
it's sort of
months.
to me, it's like seeing a house in development, and the only thing they have is like a pretty okay garage. And you go to the garage and like, what is this? Like, oh, it's a house, and it's gonna be a really good house. And, maybe you can see the ways in which it'll be a really cool house, but based on the scaffolding. But it's like if you stay around, we'll give you a bedroom in the house. A lot of people just see the house and they're like, "You're saying this is a full house? It's just scaffolding." You know, it's like you have to see this thing as like I think it's rapidly taking shape, and I think that as it goes, it'll just become cooler and cooler and cooler. The things that we're putting in landscape in the next 3 months are like things that outdo anything I've seen on similar products. So it just gets more intricate, as we go.
Yeah, that's right. I think we're at the top of the hour. So, as is customary for
Ooh,
us to do, we like to open this up as a happy hour, where we're going to make the Google Meet link that Matilda and I are currently hanging out talking on open to all of you, so you can just jump in and talk to us and ask your questions directly.
sure.
Um, we are, I think, pretty friendly, so please hop on in. I'm going to post this link right now. We'll stop the recording and stop the live stream. But for those of you that won't be joining us, thank you so much for coming. Thanks for tuning in on this. We'll be back in 2 more weeks with another dev call on something completely different, yet to be determined. If you have ideas of what you'd like to hear about us talk on in developer calls in the future, please make that known either within Urbit You can ping me at morefpodlex. You can reach out in the Foundation group. You can email me, josh@urbit.org. There's many ways to get in touch with us. Just do it. We'll find you. We'll hear you. Okay. I'm going to stop the recording. Again, thank you, Matilda. Okay, recording off. Everyone.